Yeah.
Well, we can start anytime. People are still joining the Zoom call. It's 9:01. I would think maybe we go ahead and start if that's okay with you.
Glad to.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone who has been able to join the Zoom call this morning. And while I do have some written remarks to introduce Tom Barkin, I'd like to say at the outset, Tom Barkin has shown himself to be a real friend of Appalachia, a real friend of West Virginia, someone with a caring heart for the unemployed, the chronically underemployed. I know from talking to him and with other communications with the Richmond Fed that there is really a deep concern about the level of workforce participation in West Virginia and the chronic problems we've had with workforce participation. We particularly have problems getting women and minorities into the workforce, and yet we have lots of jobs available. So those are some things that all of us who care about people and care about this state and care about this region want to work on. And Tom has shown himself to be somebody who's willing to invest personal time and really put himself into this. So Tom, at the outset, thank you for that. And I probably wouldn't be doing Tom justice if I didn't go ahead and tell you about some of his accomplishments and some of what he has done. As those of you who are joining this call know, he's the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. He's responsible for monetary policy, bank supervision, payment services, and the Fed's national IT organization. And he's been in this position since 2018. And again, this is my opportunity to say, Tom had barely started his job before he showed up in West Virginia to get a real personal upfront look at what's going on here. He serves as a voting member in 2021 on the Fed's chief monetary policy body, the Federal Open Market Committee. He's on the ground continually in the 5th District, which covers South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, DC, West Virginia, and Maryland. His engagement in the region has brought real attention to areas facing economic challenges. I would say we could underscore that. Prior to joining the Richmond Fed, Tom was a senior partner and CFO at McKinsey & Company, which, as we all know, is a worldwide management consulting firm where he also oversaw McKinsey's offices in the Southern United States. He served on the board of directors of the Atlanta Fed from 2009 to 2014 and was that board's chairman from 2013 to 2014. He's earned bachelor's, MBA, and law degrees from Harvard University. And we are very, very pleased to be able to spend some very real time with Tom Barkin. So Tom, I'm going to turn the program over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we've got a large and engaged crowd on this call. So enough of me, and now on with you. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks so much, Steve, for your nice words. And it's great to be back with folks and to see so many familiar names on the list here. So you all know me at this point, so I'm looking forward to your questions at the end, and anything you want to put on the table is great. I'll just say this is one of those ultimate challenges. We got a employment report about 30 minutes ago. So getting ready to speak to you guys is very much a real-time event, and I'll get to that in a little bit. I thought what I might do is just take a look back and then take a look forward, talk a bit about where we've been over the last year and then where we might be going. These are my views and not those of anybody else on the FOMC or in the Federal Reserve System, of course. So let me just say, looking back, it's been quite a year. And if I had been with you 12 months ago, we still would have been in the middle of an unprecedented economic shutdown. We would have been a month away from equity markets dropping 30%. Bond markets had been in such trouble that even investment grade credits were struggling to roll over commercial paper. More than 20 million people lost their jobs last April. Our economy was on the edge of a cliff, and I think it's fair to say none of us knew what was on the other side. Now, fiscal policy and monetary policy weighed in with what I would call overwhelming force. The Fed stepped up early. We took our policy rates to zero in mid-March. We worked to repair financial markets through a balance sheet. We started purchasing treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, 1.7 trillion in March and April alone last year. We also relaunched a number of the Great Recession era facilities, which backstopped specific bond markets. Congress was decisive as well. Through multiple fiscal packages, it supported those who lost their jobs, as well as small businesses and industries at risk. And to try to put the magnitude of that federal fiscal response in perspective, the 5.6 trillion in federal relief spending that's been passed during this crisis is roughly 6 times that which was passed in the 2009 American Recovery Act. So with this support, the economy's actually come most of the way back. GDP was up 6.4% in the first quarter, and it's less than 1% below its 2019 peak. And it'll likely return to the trend rate that we were on before by the end of the year. That's an incredibly fast recovery. If you remember the last downturn, it took years to get to this kind of place. And it's certainly outpaced most of the rest of the world, with the possible exception of Asia. Now, you can see the impact of this policy on the economy pretty clearly. Disposable income, which normally goes down as people lose their jobs, has actually gone up, in part because of these transfer payments. Households have increased their savings by over $2 trillion. They've paid down their credit cards. Bank portfolios have remained healthy, given all this support to individuals and businesses. The housing market has been incredibly strong, in part due to low interest rates, as well as people's increased interest in home purchases. Increased savings and social distancing fueled a shift in spending from services to goods, and that's helped manufacturers. And the worst off have benefited from stimulus checks and enhanced unemployment benefits and loan forbearance. Now, all that said, spending has come back faster than employment. There are 8.2 million fewer Americans employed today than before the crisis. And until recently, job losses exceeded those seen even at the depths of the Great Recession. We still have 5.4% fewer jobs than we had in February 2020. And the federal deficit has increased to levels we haven't seen since World War II. Now, West Virginia has done somewhat better than the country as a whole. Jobs are down a little bit less, just around 5%. Unemployment is actually lower than the national average, which is much better than we've seen historically. And participation, while still quite low, has dropped less than nationally as well. And looking forward, I'm quite hopeful we're at the brink of completing the recovery. The news on the health front's been encouraging. Vaccines are rolling out at impressive pace, and case rates and deaths have fallen. And of course, this vaccination rollout's been particularly impressive in West Virginia. I'm, of course, watching variants closely, as well as recent case increases. But I keep reminding myself that our strategy of rolling out vaccinations based on age is not a case minimization strategy. It's instead, one focused on increasing confidence by reducing the number of the most serious outcomes. And I have to say, so far, so good. Now, if you assume continued progress on the health front, I expect to see a really strong spring and summer, because you've got excess savings and fiscal stimulus, which is funding pent-up demand from consumers who are exhausted from isolation and freed up by vaccines and warmer weather. And you can already see this in the data. Consumer confidence has skyrocketed. April automobile sales were elevated at 18.5 million annual rate. March retail sales increased 9.6% versus February. The only spend that I expect to still lag is that related to return to office, things like transit or business travel or conferences or catering. But with the rest of the economy, it's quite strong. And this surge in demand is causing real challenges in our supply chain. A number of manufacturers got behind during the shutdown, and they've struggled to catch up to demand. Ships have been backlogged at West Coast ports. The ice storm in Texas disrupted chemical manufacturers. Chip shortages are limiting auto production. Houses are in short supply. A somewhat surprising supply chain challenge is in staffing. And now, this has been the case in manufacturing and construction and technology for months. But now I'm hearing even service sector companies worried about their ability to rehire and retrain enough employees to meet demand this summer. The job opening rate, that's vacancies, is 4.9%. That's a high in the nearly 25-year history of this series. And of course, that's strange when we've got 8.2 million fewer people employed and a 6.1% unemployment rate. So what's the story here? Part is the extremely steep increase in demand I discussed, and that steepness has surprised a bunch of employers. So they got behind the curve here. A part is a drop in participation, particularly from parents with elevated care responsibilities, but also from a surge in retirees. Perhaps health concerns also remain an issue, particularly when additional stimulus payments and excess savings driven by reduced spending give workers the financial wherewithal to be choosy. We got a jobs report this morning. It was an increase of 266,000 a month. That would be a strong month, not if we weren't in the middle of a downturn, but it's much weaker than this demand increase would have suggested. And I think we have a frictional challenge matching open jobs to surplus workers. The question of how to unclog this is a critical one. In the meantime, these supply chain challenges look like they're going to last the summer, and they're leading to bare shelves and lengthened delivery times. And if anybody here has tried to buy an appliance lately, you've seen that. The Richmond Fed Manufacturing Survey of vendor lead times was the longest ever, and its survey of inventories was the lowest ever. These shortages could also limit the upside in GDP if manufacturers just can't produce enough to meet this summer's demand. That then brings us to the question of inflation. Now, economic theory would suggest that strong demand and constrained supply should lead to price increases. And in truth, we're already seeing price pressures in construction materials, freight, energy, agricultural commodities. March's 12-month producer price index was up a little over 4%. And if you annualize the last 3 months, you'd even have something like 11.9%. Average home prices are up 13% year over year. That said, we don't yet see the same lift in consumer price indices. The 12-month PCE, which is the metric we watch, was up only 1.8%. The 6-month annualized version of that was 1.9%. And even the 3-month annualized version was up only 2.6%. Now, much of the producer price inflation is in non-core volatile areas like food and energy. Construction costs aren't directly measured in consumer prices, and perhaps much intermediate good inflation has largely not yet been passed on. To be clear, I do expect consumer price pressure this year. Some of that's mathematical because we're going to lap 3 deflationary months last year. Part will be a recovery in the parts of the economy like apparel and travel, which were most affected by last year's shutdowns. And if you look at last month's PCE, you'll see some of the biggest increases in places like haircuts or taxis or casinos, things which were largely shut down, which are now coming back to life. But I do think all this pent-up demand at a time of reduced supply is going to have a price impact too. And again, just try to price a rental car this weekend. But inflation is a multi-year, recurring, persistent phenomenon. And as I talk to businesses, I'm still not hearing their medium to long-term expectations on pricing changing, nor are market measures of inflation expectations escalating above our target. I have to think that long-term disinflationary forces, like the power of big box retailers and their purchasing departments, like the price transparency, which is enabled by the internet, and like global access to lower cost product and talent, are keeping expectations modulated. But I'm watching this closely, as well as whether we start to see compensation pressure coming from some of the frictional shortages I discussed earlier. You may be interested in how the proposed infrastructure and family support bills play into all this. I'll leave to Congress the determination of what passes and how to fund it. But I'd note that I really don't think the demand side is our issue anymore. It's the supply side, generating more participation, reducing job mismatch. You know, in a world where we're short construction and manufacturing workers, and infrastructure investment needs to also work to develop an infrastructure workforce. A family plan needs to get more people into the workforce. Throughout this recovery, the Fed's trying to do its part. We know that the least fortunate benefited from this historically strong labor market in 2019, and we're hoping to support bringing more people in from the sidelines by maintaining our current accommodative monetary policy so long as inflation stays moderated. Thanks, and now I'll look forward to your reactions and questions. And I'm, of course, particularly interested if anyone's seeing anything interesting in the area of labor availability and consumer prices. And so, Steve, maybe I'll turn it over to you to facilitate the questions.
This is Brian Dayton. Just to go ahead and give a reminder to everybody on how to ask questions. You can type them into the Q&A box or into the chat box, or you can go ahead and raise your hand and we can allow you to talk. So those are the 3 ways. So please ask questions those ways.
And Tom, if I may, while we're getting questions in the queue, and for those of you who are listening, this is a completely unrehearsed question. So Tom's candor is all we can expect, because there hasn't been time for any rehearsal to my question. Your discussion in the latter part of your remarks about the supply side crunch and the need for a workforce, I think, go directly to what I would consider to be the highest priorities of the West Virginia Chamber of Commerce, which is helping those who are not in the workforce get in the workforce, and helping match the needs of employers with the workforce. Clearly, we've recognized for a good many years we have a skills gap, and certainly in West Virginia, maybe more than other places, we have a skills gap. So here's, I suppose, the unrehearsed part of the question, which is, are you seeing in the district or around the country programs that actually work, and that it's fine, I'm actually asking for candor and if appropriate criticism, that we should be taking a look at here, either at the Chamber of Commerce or the business community more largely, or the business community set large, or in state policy. So I apologize for the speech before the question, but I needed to set it up a little bit. So
okay, yeah. Well, and as you know, Steve, I've been on sort of a mission to try to understand where across the district people are having impact, addressing these mismatch issues. I should start by saying there's some interesting things going on in West Virginia that I talk about to other parts of my district. I'm really impressed with the effort being placed on the broadband side, for example, to help people navigate their way into there's the whole application process, given the amount of money that's there. And I don't know if she's on or not, but I've talked to Stephanie Tyree and others on what they're doing there. I'm in Parkersburg, as I said, this week, and one of the things I want to do is follow up on a program that I heard about when I was there a year ago, which is this people who fail a drug test to work program that I know the governor set up, that I think was very interesting. And one of the things people always say, I can't hire people because they fail drug tests, and I say, well, what do you do after they fail the drug test? And they say, well, I say no. And how great wouldn't it be if you could put them in a program to get them into work? Because those are people who may have a drug problem, but have at least declared an interest in working. I'll say some of the interesting things I've seen in other places. I do think there's I'll call it whole life support need to get people from the sidelines into the workforce. We like to say the issue is education, but often the issue is, who handles the kids while you're trying to get to education, or how do you get access to the funding that you need to navigate it. Germanna is a community college in Northern Virginia that's done a lot of interesting stuff about helping people through that process through, I'll call it whole life support. I was in Manassas, Virginia, and they used some of the federal stimulus funds to give whole life support to people who are going into retraining program. Garrett County, Maryland's just over the border, and they've done a really interesting job of whole life support. So this notion of how do we get people into the workforce, often the constraint isn't their will, it's their ability to handle the combination of transportation or childcare or funding on the process end. So that's a suite of things that I think are very interesting. I think even more broadly, community colleges are doing some really useful partnerships with corporations that are helping get folks into the it's the equivalent of those programs where the wealthy people come to an underprivileged school and say, if you graduate, I'll guarantee you a job. And whenever they do that, the graduation rates go up. And they're sort of doing that with the community college thing, where companies are guaranteeing a job at the back end, and that brings people in on the front end. One thing that I'm now looking hard at, if you look at the participation issues we're having right now, it is quite clear that mothers, and particularly Black and Hispanic mothers, have had their participation drop at higher rates than others. And of course, it's not a mystery why that might have happened in a time when you've got reduced schools, schools not being open, and perhaps challenges in childcare. And so, I've heard in Parkersburg they're doing some interesting stuff on childcare. I'm looking forward to learning about that next week. And definitely that's another area where I think there's some interesting things. And, I've heard of a lot of employers who've sort of started to get into that business, whether it be proctoring or other support. So, that's another thing. And I can talk about a lot more stuff, but maybe I'll pause there, Stephen, and see if any of that resonate with you.
Those are all helpful, and I appreciate that. I do think that there can be many opportunities in West Virginia to take a look at models that have been created in places that have more resources and larger populations, and that we don't always have to reinvent the wheel. We can simply look at what has been shown to work in other places. I was in a conversation yesterday that included a couple of people, Tim Thomas, who just stepped aside as federal co-chair of the Appalachian Regional Commission, and Rochelle Goodwin, and among others. And we were talking about one of the challenges of getting people into the workforce, at least and among the three or so of us, we can certainly speak to West Virginia in this regard, which is that we've had so many, particularly younger people, who have been caught in the addiction trap, that actually has a numerical impact on the available workforce, because so many of our people have been caught in the addiction trap that we can measure the number of people who essentially are out of the workforce for that reason. So we, among us, are talking and are looking for some ideas about how to help the people who are in recovery get back into the workforce. And things that I think people don't think about, who haven't been a little closer to this, is that many of these people have lost their driver's licenses, as an example, and can't. So transportation is an issue, especially where we don't have public transportation. Tim Thomas put a fascinating idea on the table, and it's so simple as to almost seem sophomoric, and yet sometimes the easiest answer is the best answer. He said, when I think about the number of churches that have church buses, the most underutilized transportation network possibly in the nation is the church van kind of network that, for the most part, only gets used one day a week. So I've just thought, whether that could be made to work, I don't know. And he readily said he didn't know either. But those are the kinds of sort of creative ideas, who would have thought about it, kind of ideas that I think can be out there when we have collaboration. So it's clearly an issue with us in West Virginia, where we have a lot of people in rural areas who simply can't get where they need to go, or can't get to where the jobs are.
And I really got a lot out of a book called Evicted that many of you may have read. It talks a lot about evictions, of course, but it actually talks a lot just about the lives of the people who end up getting evicted. And it's just really telling how complicated their lives end up being. And, transportation, childcare, I'll call it mismatches in funding, money not coming in until after you need it, getting behind the curve, all these things, I think, that are preventing people from doing the sets of things which one needs to do to be, ready for the workforce. Another place a lot of work's being done is on incarcerated folks. I was at a poultry plant, and they were talking about how they couldn't hire people because, so many of them had felonies on their record, or flunked a drug test. And I said, well, what exactly are you worried about? Because the entry job is a chicken picker. It's somebody who actually, finds chickens and puts them on the line. I said, I just don't see the downside of hiring, but there are lots of people just won't go there. We just did a series on the impact of COVID in the classroom and on students. And one of the interesting positives is actually on incarcerated. Remote learning means that people in prison actually have access to education now in a way that they didn't. So I think there just may be some things that get unlocked here that might be interesting.
This is Brian. I had a question for you, kind of related back. You said we saw a drop off in the workforce, especially among women and minority women. One of the things we're hearing a lot of conversation about in West Virginia right now is whether or not we need to be trying to find a way to provide low cost childcare throughout the state. I can give you a personal example. My wife and I made a financial decision that it was ahead for her just to go ahead and step out of the workforce and be a stay-at-home mother, because we said cost of childcare versus what you're bringing home and take home pay, it wasn't worth the difference. Is that something? Have you seen other areas doing that? Is it working? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So let me tell you sort of what I know and what I don't know. The place that invests the most in this sort of low cost, high quality childcare is Europe. And if you look at, most Europe, especially Northern European countries, you will see a significant investment in low cost, high quality childcare, and you will see significantly higher labor force participation by women. So if Canada would be another, but I mean, those are places where it happens. Now, the trick, of course, is, how one does that efficiently. And in this country, is that government or is that private sector? Is it done through providing it or by, tax advantages? Or I think there's a lot of dynamics to actually getting it right. But I think there's a lot of magic to it. And if you look at, if you project forward for our country and the growth of our country, one of the biggest challenges we are going to have is growth in the workforce. I actually think our businesses are going to do great, but are we going to have enough workers? And some of that is because fertility has dropped. Some of that is because of challenges with immigration. But a lot of that is because people on the sidelines. And one of the reasons I've spent so much time on this is, I think, where the biggest lever is these people on the sidelines. If you look at countries like Japan that have had this demographic problem much longer, they get a lot more out of the 55 and up, and they get a lot more participation out of women. And I think they just invest in a set of things. And so I do think it's worth thinking through, how would we do this if we wanted to, increase participation by, women another 10 or 15 or 20 points. And to do that, I think you would have to solve this question. But again, why don't employers do more of it? I'm told there are liability issues that concern folks. I'm sure there are economic issues that do it. But if we get to the place where we need more workers, I think we're going to have to think about what's the efficient way to invest in this.
Sure. We thank you for that. We have a question in the queue right now from Tony Mace, and they're asking, would you please talk a little bit more about today's jobs report? Was it more weaker than expected, a little stronger than expected, and what's going on here was the question.
This is like the advanced test, since the job report came out 25 minutes before this thing. So the jobs report, increase in jobs of 266,000. If you look at the 10 years after the Great Recession, we were in the range every month of about 150 to 200. So it's a stronger jobs report than, let's just say a normal everyday jobs report, but it's nowhere near as strong as I expected. And I think as most commentators expected, given the surge in demand that I've talked about. And if you'd have seen the forecasts out in the marketplace, people were probably forecasting somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million. And this was 266. The employment rate's been dropping pretty steadily. It actually ticked up from 6.0 to 6.1. The one thing that was stronger in the report was participation increased 20 basis points, which is why the unemployment rate came up. But I think I expected it to be stronger. If you dig into it, and this is where there's still more work to be done by me, leisure and hospitality was actually up 300,000 or so. And so you would expect that to be strong as restaurants and bars and other things open. And so most everything else went the wrong way. And so then the question is it that people aren't hiring, or is it that the matching process isn't happening? And that's where I suspect, what's happening is you've got these elevated openings and, the matching isn't happening. And again, as I described in my talk, you have to speculate as to why. I think Some of it is it's been a sudden surge. Some of it is probably still, childcare and retirements, maybe even health concerns. A lot of employers, do mention these enhanced unemployment benefits, and maybe that's relevant. I'd also just point out, in addition to enhanced unemployment, in March, we sent out $1,400 checks to, a lot of people. That's even bigger than the enhanced unemployment. Savings are elevated. And so I just think people have the financial wherewithal to be perhaps a little choosy. And so we'll see. It does feel like the biggest pressure is on the low wage jobs. A couple categories I need to understand better, but the categories that dropped the most in today's jobs report were temporary help and couriers and messengers. Temporary help dropped about 110,000, couriers and messengers about 80,000. I'm not sure I understand those segments well enough, but those feel like relatively low wage segments. And so again, I think that's where the pressure is right now.
I would just have to interject that we certainly get a lot of feedback within our membership on the side that as long as people have extra cash who are not participating in the workforce, that the incentive to come back into the workforce is just not there. And I realize that there would be a number of thoughts around that point of view, but it is a point of view that we hear a lot of from within our membership. Companies just can't get people interested in coming to work because they have an alternate source of income at this time. I had a person contact me yesterday who said, let me be clear, our company is offering over $15 an hour as a starting wage, and we cannot attract people to come in and apply. And while that's anecdotal, the person who sent me the comment said, and I hope you'll pass it on to various people. So at least I can check that off my list.
Yeah, when I hear, so we've been hearing, or I've been hearing, I'd say for 6 months, people in manufacturing and construction in particular, technology, talk about how hard it is to find people. And that makes sense. Those are jobs you have to be trained for, take certain skills. The whole story of people not, people insisting their kids go to college instead of to trade school or whatever, all that is sort of to be expected. But the real change in the last month, I'd say, has been this issue of hiring entry level. And so when it was interesting to hear your example, because when I talk to folks and they tell me, oh, it's hard to find workers, the next question I say is, well, what's your entry level pay? Mm-hmm. And I would say that, I guess this is anecdotal, but it's probably a bigger sample set than one. It's a 100-person anecdotal. If their pay is $15 or up, I think the noise is much, much quieter than if their entry level pay is $15 and under. And that's just interesting to reflect on. We didn't pass a minimum wage, but there's been a lot of talk about that. And as a result of that talk, perhaps a lot of employers have started increasing their entry level compensation. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if I were an entry level employee and I had just gotten a stimulus check. I might not just immediately go back to the $10 job that I used to have. I might look around for a $12 or $13 or $14 or $15 job. And so, again, I think this is frictional, but it doesn't seem irrational to me. I mean, it seems like there's a real moment where there's competition for these workers. There's talk about higher wages. People are raising wages. And so I think there is some amount of search going on for people trying to find those wages.
I just, and again, anecdotally, but I found it very interesting. I was in Huntington, West Virginia on Tuesday, where there is a sign in front of a restaurant offering a $1,000 signing bonus for those who will come in and interview and accept employment. So
you hear a lot about that.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that's definitely happening is people are running short. So, next time you're in a restaurant, now that I know you've been double vaccinated, just check your service times. It's not what you expect, and then just have some empathy for the restaurant owner, because they probably love to get their staff back. It's just a struggle.
We have another question that has come in to the Q&A box, and the question is, would you discuss your current thinking on what you will consider when looking at potential tapering and asset purchases?
Yeah, so in December, we said we will continue on our current course until we see substantial further progress on our mandated goals. And at the time, and our two goals would be our employment and inflation. For inflation, I look at the core PCE price index, which in December was at 1.4. Our target is 2. And as I said earlier, I think right now we're at 1.8. So we're making, I think, real progress on the inflation side. And I'm feeling pretty positive on that. On maximum employment, the metric I have in my head is employment to population. It seems like a reasonably holistic metric that takes into account both unemployment, but also people who've dropped out of the workforce and aren't looking for a job. That was 61.1 in February of 2020. It was 57.4 in December when we looked for substantial further progress. As of this morning, it's 57.9. So we've gone from 57.4 to 57.9. And, you know, if you will, getting back to where we were, maybe we can't get all the way back, but getting back to where we were at 61.1. And I'm looking for substantial further progress on that metric. And, you know, as I suggested earlier, I guess I've kind of hoped to see an even stronger report today than we saw. So we'll see where we go on that.
Well, Tom, and this may end up being the concluding remark. I'm not sure. We are giving people time to put their questions into the Q&A, and people have been. But it would just be as we in West Virginia try to create a model that works, we're going to continue to look for who seems to have gotten it right. And you said at the outset you were going to share some personal thoughts. So I'll share a personal thought related to workforce improvement initiatives in West Virginia. And that is that I think we need a closer linkage between our community and technical colleges, the employer community, and Workforce West Virginia. And we certainly are interested in doing our part. And we know, by the way, from conversations with the CTCs and Workforce West Virginia, that each of those entities is interested in and wants to do its part. So we believe that the effort has to be collaborative, obviously, that there has to be some official linkage, and that we've, thanks to Senate Bill 1, we have affordable CTC in West Virginia now. I've been asked to not refer to it as free. It's last dollar CTC in West Virginia, but essentially we've made it so people who otherwise might not be able to afford to go can go. And now we need to marry up the needs of employers and the work of Workforce West Virginia. I'm speaking to Workforce West Virginia in the next week or two on that topic. And we know the CTCs are all in. So what we would love to see is a model of somebody who we think really has gotten it right and really can demonstrate the effectiveness of their program. So those are some things we're going to be working on. If I had a wand to wave, by the way, I would change the Workforce Investment Act a little bit. It's been modified once since its original creation. And there are some other things I would do, but we have other congressional priorities, and who knows whether Congress will be able to get to taking a look at what parts of the Workforce Investment Act are really working and what parts could be modified or improved. But we know you have a view of this that's much larger than ours, and you have the opportunity to see many other places. So input on those subjects would be not only welcome, but really taken to heart.
Well, I think you're emphasizing three things, all of which matter. One is true partnerships between employers and community or technical colleges, so that people who graduate with the right certificate or degree programs, know with confidence that they've got employment. And I think that's happening in lots of places around the district, and it's happening in West Virginia. And I think that's quite doable. That's quite doable. The second part, which, as you said, West Virginia's done, Virginia's done with its Fast Forward program, is making these programs affordable. There's always stuff you can do to do those a little bit better. One of the things that I think should be on the list, and when I talk to legislative leaders, is on the list but never sort of makes the list, is these Pell Grants, and why wouldn't they be applicable to certificate programs? State lottery programs, and why wouldn't they be applicable to certificate programs? So I think there is something about affordability that's there. And then the part that I'm increasingly intrigued by, and I mentioned it, I think, earlier with Germanna Community College, and is this notion of whole life support to get people through. The completion rate on community colleges is just not high. It's less than 50% in most programs. And so this notion of what kind of support one needs, and again, financial's part of it, but as Brian said earlier, transportation, childcare, all of these things, I think roll into what it takes to get someone who has good intent to get them all the way through. And this sort of tracking whole life support, I've heard lots of interesting things about how people are monitoring even remote learning, whether people are logging on or not, with what frequency, and giving people a phone call if they haven't logged on, and whatever navigational support to help get people through these programs. I think that's really the third part of the stool there. And I think when those things come together, you really do get folks into it. And then you start working topics, which you do hear in some places, around capacity. For nurses, for example, getting clinical placements, or for drivers, getting enough testers or licensors in the state. And I don't know if those are issues in West Virginia. It is issues in a couple other states. Instructors, licensing tests, clinical placements, all those. But that's number 4. If you can get the first 3 working, then you'll have capacity problems. Then you unleash the 4th.
Well, and I doubt that Brian would mind my being this personal, but when he made reference to his wife having left the workforce,
he really opened it up. Then we can talk about
he
it.
Did. Here we go, Brian. Yeah, get ready, Brian. Here we go. What I would say about his wife is that she's a highly qualified professional healthcare deliverer who made the choice to, so his comments are even more relevant, I think, in that context. So, Tom, I want to say thank you. You've certainly offered insight and thought-stimulating conversation here. We look forward to more of these kinds of conversation, and we'll look forward to following up with you. I've made notes about Evicted. That's a book I'm not familiar with, so I've made notes about that. And I want to look at Virginia's Fast Forward program, and very much appreciate your conversation about the Pell Grants and lottery funds potentially being used for certificate programs. So as always, thank you. And again, thank you for your deep interest and concern here in West Virginia. And I know throughout the district, but we very much appreciate the interest and personal involvement that you have shown in West Virginia. So we look forward to welcoming you. Safe travels to Parkersburg next week. And to you and everyone on the call, best wishes with getting vaccinated. We're finding within our membership that the vaccination rate is very, very high. And fortunately, here in West Virginia, access to vaccination is very good. And so now we want to get everybody else up to a level that we begin to see real herd immunity. And fingers crossed, that's beginning to happen. So,
right. Thanks, Steve, and everybody have a great weekend. Great to be with you.
Thank you very, very much. Great to get to see you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.